can get their opportunity. And I'll start off by making sure that I don't exceed my 7 minutes. So prior to the final flight out, we heard from both American citizens and Afghan partners seeking to access the airport, but they were either not being allowed through the gates, being sent back home, or simply abandoned. While we understand and appreciate the security issues that were at play, it's confounding that such a chaotic process arose to begin with. So when did the administration begin to plan for a worst case scenario contingency?
In the spring and summer.
In the spring and summer of this year?
Yes, multiple interagency meetings, exercises, looking at the different contingencies.
And so what was the specific planning put into the likely scenario that American citizens were going to have to evacuate under hostile conditions?
Well, planning went to a number of things, including the ability to move our embassy quickly, as we did in 48 hours, including the effort to make sure that we could control the airport, bring flights in, and evacuate people out. One of the things that happened, as you know, Mr. Chairman, is that the situation outside the airport became incredibly chaotic, with thousands of people massing at the airport, massing at the gates of the airport, and that created, among other things, a very, very challenging situation.
Should we not have started earlier? Should not have been a bigger surge on the SIV issue? I recognize, I think it's only fair to put in context that your own testimony suggested that there was a 17,000 SIV backlog. There hadn't 9 months had passed by without a single interview. So obviously you inherited a significant backlog. But and how many SIVs were awarded during the Trump administration?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think over the course of the administration, there must have been several thousand.
Okay. So the question is then, should we not have surged more significantly? I know you said you put up to 50 individuals, but knowing that you were preparing for a contingency of a worst case scenario, should not back in March there have been a more significant surge to process SIVs and determine the entire universe and who needed to be taken out?
Well, I believe we did surge those resources. As I said, we quadrupled the number of people in Washington doing processing of SIVs, and this is at a critical stage in the processing. As I think many members know, the most important stage in many ways is the so-called chief of mission approval. That's the stage at which SIV applicants are actually deemed eligible under the criteria established by Congress for the program. And by the way, those who apply, those who actually get chief of mission approval, the washout rate is about 40% historically. That's because it turns out that many people who apply don't qualify under the criteria set by Congress, or they're unable to get the documentation. I think this was alluded to prove that they had worked faithfully and loyally for the United States. There's some situations where people are committing fraud in order to get into the program, maybe for understandable reasons. But the point is, we have a very lengthy process, 14 steps, multiple agencies involved. We've worked to try to streamline that. I think there's more work that we would like to do going forward to do that. But the bottom line is, we did significantly surge our resources to that, particularly to the chief of mission approval process, quadrupling them. And ultimately, we went from 10 to 50 to now, I believe, 61 or 62, working on that stage of things. We doubled the resources we had in Kabul, all in an effort to expedite. And we did. We went from 100 visas a week to 1,000 visas a week. But what was not anticipated was the collapse in 11 days of the Afghan government and the Afghan military.
Let me ask you this. There have been numerous press reports over the past week about a new or refined process for the State Department to lead efforts in coordination with the Department of Defense to work with outside groups to evacuate American citizens and Afghan allies left behind in Afghanistan. Can you tell us exactly what these new U.S. government-led efforts are, how coordination with outside groups and individuals being handled by who, what is the nature of the state DoD cooperation? Give us a sense of that.
Sure. We have within the department, led by our former ambassador to Afghanistan, John Bass, who went back to Kabul to the airport to help lead the evacuation efforts. He is leading an effort to manage, coordinate all of the ongoing efforts to bring people who wish to leave Afghanistan out. And that includes, among other things,
Good morning.
a coordination with the many outside groups, as well as members of Congress who are working themselves heroically to help in this effort. I met myself with about 75 veterans organizations a couple of weeks ago, given the extraordinary efforts that veterans, either individually or as groups, are doing to help. And we want to make sure that we are as coordinated as we possibly can be on these efforts to make sure that we know who is doing what assistance we can provide, and to make sure that we're working together going forward. We have many other people working on this task force, some dedicated to American citizens, others focused on SIVs and other Afghans at risk, others focused.
All right. Welcome to the Lady Lacey Show, everybody. Good morning. And this is a very important meeting. We're on the Foreign Relations Senate Committee, I think. I'm on their website, .gov. So, you know, it's a free broadcast. Perks of being part of the corporation is we get to use the corporation's library for free. Happy ending to the summer. And got me a pumpkin. I got pumpkin flavored coffee, pumpkin flavored donuts, pumpkin flavored bread, and I'm just ready. I'm done with this summer. Oh gosh. It's been too hot here in Tennessee. Like, if you can go somewhere else besides being Tennessee during the summer, I suggest that. Unless you got some really good air conditioning. And of course, we got tons of tunnels all over our major cities here in Tennessee and little cities. So, mud flood buildings. Yeah, if you like that kind of stuff. All right. Oh. Will has commented, I had a pumpkin muffin the other day. Very gooey and yummy. Well, good for you. Ooh, and I got I wanted to make my own soup, but I couldn't find no butternut squash, so it must not be ready yet. So I had to get it in a box. Not a can, but a box. But I'm ready to eat that. So here we go back. I mean, the reason I'm playing this is like for historical purposes. I don't like anybody in politics. I'm critical of pretty much everybody, and so that makes it fair, you know. And they're talking about Afghanistan. I don't endorse anything these people say. Most of it, it's just y'all know. Y'all know what day it is. Y'all know what kind of week we've had here. So I'm over it.
Focused on coordinating with different groups, including members of Congress.
Let me give you my final minute. I'd like to give you an opportunity to set the record straight on one point. Now, several commentators have suggested that had the department moved forward with the Crisis Contingency and Response Bureau proposed by the Trump administration as it was walking out the door, it would have been able to respond better to the Afghan situation. But it's my understanding that that bureau had not been stood up yet when you decided to curtail the proposal, nor as proposed did it actually add any additional resources or capabilities to those that state already had. It was a bureaucratic movement.
Good morning, Zulu. It's all lies, all bunch of liars. Just lying through the teeth. Shout out to Zulu. It's 9:14. So I'm Central Time.
not creating or getting rid of
It must
actual
be
capabilities, just a new
specific.
organizational chart.
Yeah.
And in that bureaucratic reshuffling, potentially creating damage to the department's operations, not solving them. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. If it's not the CCR, then what is the answer?
Well, here again,
Oktoberfest, Mama. That's right. That's right. Yeah, y'all stay tuned on that one. And oh yeah, congratulations to the Lady Lacy Show viewers with the shorts that I've been doing lately. We've gotten over 16,000 views on this channel. Yes, we have. We have made fun of Trudeau. We have made, I made the videos. Y'all watched them. Y'all spread them. We made fun of Trump. 9/11. The building 7, 6.6 second building falling. That one got over 1,000 views. The Trump one's about to hit 2,000. The one with the mailbox and the letter has nothing to do with anything on this, whatever. But that one got 11,000. And so congratulations to us. We are winners. We are the best.
and to your point,
Keep it flat.
with regard to the CCR, whether it became a bureau or not, there was no change in the assets that we already had at hand to work on these efforts. And the focus of this group, either in its existing organizational structure or had it become a bureau, which, among other things, it didn't because there were congressional holds from across the aisle on this effort. The previous administration, nonetheless, went through and tried to move it forward. We decided that we needed to review it. We did the review, and as you described very accurately, we found that this would add no assets to what we already had at hand. It would simply create a different bureaucratic structure. But having said that, again, this is something designed primarily for individual extractions, medical emergencies. These men and women who are part of our operational medical unit are remarkable and do incredible work, but not the kind of work that would have been applicable
That's
to
right.
the large evacuation that we had to conduct.
Oh, it's
Senator
time for
Rist.
it's the day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I can
Okay,
tell you,
we're going back to
listening to you and a handful
Afghanistan.
of other people try to put the best face on this possible. And I can tell you that the temperature of the American people is not there with you. And that, I'm not talking from a partisan basis. This goes both ways. You know, there is not enough lipstick in the world to put on this pig to make it look any different than what it actually is. So we need, the American people want to know who's responsible for this. So let's start with this. Who is responsible? Who made the decisions on this? Was it the President of the United States?
Ultimately, the president makes the decisions. That's correct.
Did he in this case?
As in every case, ultimately decisions that can only be decided by the president are decided by the president.
Well,
Now, of course, to be specific, Senator, there are hundreds, thousands of decisions every single day that go into a situation as complex as this one. The big strategic decisions, those are decided by the president. The tactical, operational decisions are made by different agencies, agency heads, agency officials.
well, I'm more interested in the top decision making. Look, we've all seen this. We saw it as recently as yesterday. Somebody in the White House has authority to press the button and stop the president, cut off the president's speaking ability and sound. Who is that person?
I think anyone who knows the president, including members of this committee, knows that he speaks very clearly and very deliberately for himself. No one else does.
Well, are you saying that there's no one in the White House that can cut him off? Because yesterday that happened, and it's happened a number of times before that. It's been widely reported that somebody has the ability to push the button and cut off his sound and stop him from speaking. Who is that person?
There is no such person. Again, the president speaks for himself, makes all of the strategic decisions, informed by the best advice that he can get from the people around him.
So are you unaware that this is actually happening? Because it happened yesterday at the Interagency Fire Center. It was widely reported. The media's reported on it, and it's not the first time it's happened. It's happened several times. Are you telling this committee that this does not happen? That there's no one in the White House who pushes the button and cuts him off in mid-sentence?
That's correct.
So this didn't happen yesterday, nor on the other occasions where the media showed the American people that his sentence was cut off in mid-sentence. Are you saying that didn't happen?
Senator, I really don't know what you're referring to. All I can tell you is, having worked with the president for now 20 years, both here on this committee and over the last 9 months at the White House, the president very much speaks for himself.
Well, let's take a different attack. He does speak for himself, but what happens when somebody doesn't want him speaking? You're telling us you don't know anything about this, that somebody cuts him off in mid-sentence. Is that what you're trying to tell this committee? Because everybody here has seen it.
Senator, I'm telling you, based on my own experience with the president over the last 20 years, anyone who tried to stop him from saying what he wanted to say, speaking his mind, would probably not be long for their job.
Let's turn to the dissent cable that you received in July. Are you willing to give a copy of this dissent cable that you got from 24 diplomats regarding the imminent catastrophic collapse in Afghanistan? Are you willing to give a copy of that to this committee?
Senator, this dissent channel is something that I place tremendous value and importance on. It's a way for people in the State Department to speak the truth as they see it to power. And these cables, I've read every single one of the dissent channel cables that we've gotten during this administration. I've responded to every single one. I factored what I read and heard into my thinking and into my actions. But the legitimacy of the channel, the ability for people to be able to, with confidence, share their thoughts, share their views, even when they run counter to what their seniors have said or the policies being prescribed. It's vital.
Alrighty, so top of the hour. Let's go to the comments. Voynich was here. Will's here. Zulu was here. Plaso Platos. I remember who that is. Yep. Shout out your name. I'm at work, so I can't hang out. I just wanted to stop in and say hey to y'all. Be strong, vigilant. Fire emoji. Thank you very much for that. Voynich is a classic here. The hardest part of 2 weeks to flatten the curve is always the first 18 months. Yeah! That's why we got Voynich from the Netherlands. William Green says this is total crap. I agree with you. Voynich says, hi, Lacey. Hi, Voynich. Francis Sage says, that lady in the back, her mask is shaped like a Guy Fawkes' deal. I don't know. Or is it just me? It's just you. And Jameson Kimbrell. Wow. All right. So rock on, guys. It's 10 o'clock. 10:03 here at the Lady Lisa Show. I'm going to pay attention to the time. Zulu's only making me better. And we're talking about Afghanistan. Something happened. I have no thoughts. I am just watching this free video, broadcasting it to you from the Foreign Relations Committee.gov website. And if some of y'all are going to watch this anyway, you might as well watch it with me and let me collect the minutes and get the views. Because you love me more than you love other broadcasters. And I know it. And I appreciate you. I love y'all too.
Vitally important that we protect that channel, protect its integrity. And it is designed by its very regulations only to be shared with senior officials in the department. And what I don't want to see is some kind of chilling effect going forward that says to those who would think of writing a cable in the future that this will get out widely, be distributed in ways that that would have that chilling effect.
Do you admit that you received a dissent cable in July signed by 24 diplomats that warned about the imminent catastrophic collapse that was coming in Afghanistan?
Senator, I certainly received the cable in mid-July. I read it. I responded to it. I factored its contents into my thinking. And what the cable said broadly was two things. It did not suggest that the government and security forces were going to collapse prior to our departure. It did express real concerns about the durability of that government and force after our departure, and it focused on the efforts that we were making, particularly on the SIV front, to try to expedite moving them out. And in fact, a number of the recommendations, the very good recommendations it made, were already in train. Others were not, but one of the ones that was in train was the establishment of Operation Allies Refuge. We received the cable on July 13th. That operation was actually put into force on July 14th. It had already been planned for some time, and this was an effort to expedite the identification and relocation of SIVs, actually putting them on planes, which, as you know, is not part of the program, actually relocating them and working to establish transit sites so that we could put them there while we finished processing them.
Well, you see, that's the problem with us not having access to that cable. You're telling us that, but we have been told by others that it was significantly different than what you're saying. Also, we really would like to see the response to that, because I think history is going to be interested in that particular cable and your response to it. I'll save my next question for the next round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cardin, I've asked Senator Cardin to, in addition to his questions, preside for a few minutes since I have a hearing that I have to just go to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you during the Afghan evacuations for almost the daily briefings you had for all members of the United States Senate and keeping us totally informed as to the events unfolding. I contrast that to what happened during the Trump years, where we were not kept informed at all about the negotiations between the Trump administration and the Taliban, that we had no briefings or information at all in regards to the summit meetings between the United States and North Korea, or the United States and Russia, where our committee could not conduct the oversight that is so important, as you have pointed out, working with the executive branch in a check and balance for the unity of our country. So I thank you very much for the way that you have kept us engaged and informed as decisions have been made. As you pointed out, the Biden administration was dealt a very difficult hand on the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We all recognized we needed to withdraw. The options were extremely limited. The mistakes made by previous administrations, we've talked about it, but I think we need to understand that many of us did not support the 2002 campaign to go into Iraq. And one of those reasons was that we wanted to complete the mission in Afghanistan when we had a chance to do it when the Taliban was diminished after our military came in after the attack on our country. But instead, we went into Iraq, which was not engaged in the 9/11 activities, and we never finished Afghanistan, a mistake made by the Bush administration. And we've already talked about the Trump administration and setting a deadline and releasing prisoners and moving forward with the reduction of troops when there was really very little options that the administration had. It doesn't negate the information that was made available to you about the strength of the Afghan security forces and the Ghani administration's will to stand. And I think many of us are interested in knowing how intelligence got that so wrong. And the contingency plans are ones that we really do want to review, because it seems to us there had to be better ways to secure passage into the airport than what ultimately happened. But considering the hand that you were dealt, considering the crisis that developed, evacuating 124,000 was a miraculous task. So we congratulate all that were involved in the evacuation of so many people under such a short period of time, under such difficult circumstances. I want to get to where we are today. During this process, the State Department was very open to all members of Congress, Democrats, Republicans, as we filtered information into you about vulnerable people in an effort to get them out of Afghanistan. Today, our offices are still being deluged by requests to help people that are in Afghanistan. NGOs are working very aggressively. Can you share with us the process that you're using in order to filter information about Americans that are still in Afghanistan who want to leave, those that apply for SIV status, and those Afghans that are at risk? How do we transmit that information, and what process is in place so that we can try to get these people out of Afghanistan?
Yes, thank you, Senator. As I noted, we've established a task force focused entirely on relocation to help those who wish to leave Afghanistan, whether they're any remaining American citizens, whether it's SIV applicants, whether it's Afghans at risk, whether it's the nationals of partner countries, get out. And that involves a number of things. It involves, for the American citizens, case management teams, 500 individuals whose task is to be in constant contact with any remaining American citizens who wish to leave, and that's what they're doing. It also includes, together with our Legislative Affairs Office, being in constant contact with you, as well as with outside groups who have identified and are trying to help people who seek to leave. This here is the sum total of cases brought to us by members of this committee, just this committee, that all of you, or many of you, have been working, and we are deeply grateful for those efforts, for this information. It ensures that when you send us the information, we put it into our database. If it's not already there, we make sure that we're able to track it. We make sure we're able to coordinate with you. And I recognize that, especially in the early going, during the evacuation itself, some of the feedback was lacking. We were trying to do all of this in real time, making sure that we took in the information that you were providing and acting on it. And in some cases, we didn't get back to people to say, here's what we've done. And we've been working to make sure that we get back to everyone. I think we had 26,000 inquiries from Congress. We've responded to 21 or 22,000 of them.
So we still have the categories of reporters that work for us that are still in Afghanistan. We have women officials that were officials in Afghanistan that are at risk. We have NGOs that worked with us in Afghanistan, their employees that are at risk. So you're saying we still have an opportunity to work with you to get that information to the sources that you're using to try to arrange for their exit from Afghanistan?
Yes, absolutely. And we very much invite that. And we want to make sure that we have as best possible a unified, coordinated list so that we know what everyone is working on, and we can track and we can help, or we can take on, depending on the.
And can I get your best guess on the numbers? At one point when we first started, we thought there might be somewhere around a little less than 100,000 of U.S. citizens, SIVs, and Afghans at risk that wanted to leave. Obviously, that number was low. We've already evacuated over 124,000. Do we know how many U.S. citizens are in Afghanistan that want to exit today? How many are in SIV status that want to exit, and how many Afghans at risk we want to help?
On the American citizens who wish to leave, the number is about 100, and it's very hard to give a real-time number at any given moment because it's very fluid, by which I mean this. Some people, we're in direct contact with this group. Some, for very understandable reasons, are changing their mind from day to day about whether or not they want to leave. Others continue, even now, to raise their hands and say, I'm an American citizen in Afghanistan, someone who had not identified themselves before. And again, I think, as all of you know very, very well, we do not require as a country our citizens to register or identify themselves to our embassies in any country in the world when they travel there or if they reside there.
And do you have the numbers for SIV and for?
So the SIV numbers that we're tabulating right now because we're trying to account for everyone who has come in. Some people remain in transit countries. Other people are now in the United States. We're putting all of those numbers together to determine the overwhelming majority of Afghans who have come out of Afghanistan, thanks to our evacuation efforts, are in one way or another Afghans at risk. Some will be SIV applicants. Others will be P1 or P2 applicants. Others will be in none of those categories, but Afghans at risk. We're breaking down all of those numbers, and we should have a breakdown for you in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing that. Senator Rubio?
Thank you. Secretary, in your statement, I think that the most troubling thing is the following quote from you. Even the most pessimistic assessment did not predict the government forces in Kabul would collapse while U.S. forces remained. I back that up by saying you also cite General Milley, who said there was no indication that there would be a rapid collapse of the Afghan army and government. For much of last year, I was the acting chairman of intelligence. I'm now the vice chairman of intelligence. I've been tracking this very, very closely. And just going back to the beginning of this year, obviously I can't quote the titles of the pieces, but let me suffice it to say that there are numerous pieces that would be categorized as it's going to hit the fan. And but let's just for a moment put that aside, okay? Because I think any analysis of those pieces would have led anyone to that conclusion. Putting that aside for a moment, we had every reason to believe and to plan for the rapid collapse of the Afghan military and the Afghan government. At the beginning of 2020, by all admissions, we had already really bad status quo in Afghanistan. Okay, we had a small footprint, but we had a strong commitment to air support. And that sustained the Afghan security forces' ability to resist the Taliban. The security forces of Afghanistan were suffering 10,000 casualties a year. The Taliban was suffering casualties too, but they enjoyed safe haven in Pakistan. They were able to go there to rest, to refit, to train, to recruit. And so in summary, even before the withdrawal, we had a terrible status quo. The security forces, a small number of U.S. forces, continued to die. We had U.S. losses as well. I want to mention that, but the Afghan government was still fractious and corrupt, and the Taliban had an unchallenged safe haven in Pakistan. Or put another way, and paraphrasing your own words from your opening statement, if after 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in support, equipment, and training, there's not enough for the Afghan government or the Afghan security forces to become more resilient or self-sustaining, what did we think was going to happen as that support began to be removed? What did we think was going to happen when that terrible status quo was changed? It doesn't take some exquisite piece of intelligence or some brilliant analysis to conclude that if you radically change an already bad status quo, by removing U.S. and NATO forces, by ending enablers and air support, the status quo was going to collapse in favor of the Taliban. This is not an argument in favor of staying. I think that ship has sailed, okay? And I know a lot of time has been spent on justifying the withdrawal. We're not debating the withdrawal. What I'm arguing is we had a terrible status quo as is, by your own admission. The Afghan government, even after billions of dollars in 20 years, was not self-sustaining, was not resilient. We should have known that as we began to draw down support, we were going to see the potential for a collapse. And that's what all these pieces pointed to as well. So it's concerning that no one saw all of this and concluded that there was no evidence or no reason to believe that there could be a rapid collapse. More to that point, we began to see clear signs weeks ago that this is where it was headed. Without airstrikes, the Taliban now began to mass and maneuver, going from intimidating these small Afghan outposts to actually getting them into quitting. We were seeing Afghan outposts begin to quit. They went from surrounding these small provincial capitals to surrounding major cities with 5,000 to 8,000 Taliban fighters. This is weeks before. By the way, this is at the same time as I believe on July 8th, President Biden was still giving this naive, optimistic prediction about the fighting capabilities of the Afghan forces and so forth. We could see them meticulously focused on the north. You could see that they were methodically and carefully splintering the sclerotic remains of any sort of resistance. Weeks before the fall of Kabul, you could see the Taliban was on the verge, was headed towards doing something they hadn't done before. They were going to isolate Kabul from the north, cutting off all their supply routes. So we knew before we knew weeks before that we were headed for a Taliban control of the north. All the traditional routes of Taliban encroachment on Kabul were nearly sealed, the south and the east. Kabul faced the prospect of no fuel. The Afghan government faced the prospect of being unable to mount any viable opposition and sustain defense. What did we think was going to happen? All of those things were in place at the time. And I think the most concerning part of it is that if we didn't have an analysis that looked at all this, this wasn't a failure of intelligence. This was a failure of policy and planning. We have the wrong people analyzing this. Someone didn't see this. Either someone didn't see this or someone didn't want to see this, because we had established this. We wanted to be out by September 11th so that we could have some ceremony that arguing that we got and pulled out of Afghanistan on the anniversary of 9/11. The fact of the matter is, where it leaves us now, on top of all the other things that have been mentioned here from a geopolitical perspective, is not a good place. I think China and Russia and Iran, they look at this botch withdrawal, and what they see is incompetence that they think they might be able to exploit, may lead to miscalculation. I think the Europeans, our allies, who had very little say, if any, or control certainly over the timing and the execution of all this, they're now, number one, have to be wondering about our reliability, the credibility of our defense agreements with them. But they also have to be really, really upset at the prospects of a massive refugee crisis landing right on their borders here very soon. And India, and I know that there was an announcement today, there'll be a meeting of the Quad fairly soon, which is a good development, except that in the Pacific region, if you're India, you're looking at this and saying, if the United States allowed Pakistan to unravel their standing, because the Pakistani role in all this, and I think multiple administrations are guilty of ignoring it, the Pakistani role in enabling the Taliban is ultimately a victory for those pro-Taliban hardliners in the Pakistani government. They have to be looking at this and saying, if the United States could have, a third-rate power like Pakistan unravel its aims, what chance do they have of confronting China? So I think this leaves us in a terrible situation, but I go back to the initial point. I don't know how it's possible. If in fact, the people in charge of our foreign policy did not see all of these factors and conclude that there was a very real possibility of a very rapid collapse, then we've got the wrong people making military and diplomacy decisions in our government.
Senator, I'm happy to respond briefly in the time that we have. As you know, from your own expertise and leadership on these matters, there are constant assessments being done, and in this particular case, assessments being done of the resilience of Afghan security forces, of the Afghan government, and different scenarios established, from worst case to best case to everything in between. And ultimately, the preponderance of the intelligence and assessments land someplace, and there are always going to be voices, and critically important that we listen to all of them, who may be talking about exclusively the worst case, some best case, some in between. Here's what I can say in this setting, and we can take this up as well in other settings. Back in February, the assessment of the overall assessment of the community was that after a complete U.S. military withdrawal, that could potentially, in the worst case scenario, lead to the Taliban capturing Kabul within a year or two. So that's back in February, and that was more or less where things stood in the winter and into the spring. By July, and you're exactly right, that the situation was deteriorating as the Taliban continued to make progress on the ground throughout the summer. In July, the IC indicated that it was more likely than not that the Taliban would take over by the end of the year, the end of this year. That said, we, the intelligence community, did not say that the countrywide collapse of all meaningful resistance would be likely to occur in a matter of days. And you referenced Chairman Milley, as I did earlier. Nothing that he saw, that I saw, that we saw, suggested that this government and security force would collapse in a matter of 11 days. And you're right that I think we need to look back at all of this because, to your point, we collectively, over 20 years, invested extraordinary amounts in those security forces and in that government. Hundreds of billions of dollars, equipment, training, advice, support. And based on that, as well as based on what we were looking at real time. Again, we did not see this collapse in a matter of 11 days. But it is important that we go back and look at all of this.
The time has expired.
Thank you.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for appearing before the committee today. I appreciate and share the frustration of my colleagues over the challenges with the evacuation, over the situation of special immigrant visa applicants, and the Taliban's treatment of women and girls and other minorities. But I also agree with your assessment and that's been given by several others, that where we were when we got to that evacuation was because of the failure of both Democratic and Republican administrations. And I want to know where that outrage was when year after year, for 10 years, starting with Senator McCain, I and others in the Senate tried to get more special immigrant visa applicants through the process so that they could leave Afghanistan, leave the threat, and come to the United States. And there were a few Republicans in the Senate who blocked us year after year from getting more SIV applicants to the United States. And I want to know where that outrage was during the negotiations by the Trump administration and former Secretary Pompeo, when they were giving away the rights of women and girls, and when Secretary Pompeo came before this committee and blew off questions about what they were doing to pressure the Taliban to have women at the negotiating table for that peace treaty. So I think there is a lot of regret and a lot of recriminations to go around. And the important thing for us to do now is to figure out how we can work together to address those people who still need to be evacuated from Afghanistan, and also to ensure that we can do everything possible with the international community to help protect the human rights of the women and girls who remain in the country and those minorities. So, Mr. Secretary, that's where I'm going to put my effort. I do think we need an accounting. That's important for history and for us going forward. But let's stop with the hypocrisy about who's to blame. There are a lot of people to blame, and we all share in it. Now, Mr. Secretary, as you know, I was one of those who was opposed to our withdrawing from Afghanistan. I'm not going to revisit that, but a lot of my concerns were around the rights of women and girls if Afghanistan fell into the hands of the Taliban. So I want to ask you now, and you've been very specific on briefing calls that you share the concern, and I recognize that you believe it's a priority for this administration to do what you can to protect the rights of women and girls. So can you talk specifically about what steps the department is taking to provide for the safety of women and girls, and how we're trying to rally the international community behind that effort?
Yes, thank you, Senator. And let me just start by thanking you personally for your leadership for a long time now on these issues, both on the SIVs and the work that we've actually been able to do to try to improve the program, but more work needs to be done, as well, of course, as on women and girls. From advancing women, peace, and security and that agenda to ensuring that there's an equal playing field for women and girls. You made a huge difference. And I have to say, over the last 20 years, we have made a difference collectively in Afghanistan. And possibly the biggest difference we made was for women and girls. Access to education, access to healthcare, access to work, and opportunity. All of that was as a result of many of the efforts that we made and that this Congress made and supported, including with very, very significant assistance. This is hard. I was in Kabul after the president announced his decision. I met with women leaders from the then parliament, NGOs, lawyer, human rights defenders, listened and heard from them about their concerns about the future. Just the past couple of weeks when I was out in Doha and then in Ramstein, I talked to young women and girls who we'd evacuated and heard from them both of their gratitude for having been evacuated, but also their deep concerns more than deep concerns about the future for the women and girls who remain in Afghanistan. So with that very much in mind, we have done a few things, and this is where we really want to work closely with you and with every member. One, we've worked to rally the international community to set very clear expectations of the Taliban going forward, to include the expectation that it will uphold the basic rights of women and girls as well as minorities. And that's visible in the statement that more than 100 countries have signed at our initiative. It's also in a UN Security Council resolution that we initiated and got passed. And I know people say, "Oh, it's a statement or a Security Council resolution. It doesn't matter." Well, in the case of the Security Council resolution, just to cite one example, there are significant sanctions that from the United Nations on the Taliban. There are travel restrictions on the Taliban, and the idea that if the Taliban is in violation of the Security Council resolution that we established, it will get any relief just on that alone, the UN sanctions or travel restrictions, I think that's pretty clear that won't happen. That's just one point of leverage. We've been working to make sure that the international community speaks with one voice and acts together, including on this. That's one. Second, we want to make sure that assistance continues to flow. Humanitarian assistance, including assistance that's directed at the special needs of women and girls. We're doing that consistent with our sanctions, and we're able to do that by working through NGOs and the UN agencies. Now, I don't want to sugarcoat this because we know that while the Taliban seeks and will probably support and protect basic humanitarian assistance through these agencies, like for food and medicine, it may be a different story when it comes to things that are directed specifically at women and girls. So we're going to be very focused on that and trying to make sure that that assistance can go through, that it's monitored effectively, including by the agencies doing it. And I spent some time talking with the head of the United Nations effort on this in terms of having a clear monitoring mechanism for this and to carry that forward. Next, we will soon appoint, at my direction, a senior official responsible for focusing and marshaling all of our efforts on support for women, girls, and minorities in Afghanistan. I think it's very important that we have a focal point in the U.S. government, at the State Department, whose responsibility is to carry forward this agenda, working closely with you in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I'm out of time, but can you share with us who that official is as soon as they're appointed?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, if I were just to read your testimony, not having watched any news, I would literally think this was a smashing success. But I do read the news, as most Americans do, and we realize this was a complete debacle. And I think what concerns me the most, among many things, is that detachment from realities. It's the same denial of reality, for example, on the border. A self-inflicted wound, a crisis created by President Biden's policies that have completely thrown open.
Welcome, guys. Welcome to Lady Lacy's show. This is Lady Lacy. It is 10:33 on 9/14. Let me double check that. Yep, it's a Tuesday. Don't forget to feed your cats. And we are watching Everybody Blame Everybody About Afghanistan. And it's interesting. But yeah, I think that lady was right when she said it's everybody's fault. You know, step one, take responsibility. Denial, you know, I guess it's part of grief, and a lot of people are still in denial. There's always people. Most of those and these people are going to stay in denial, but some of them will actually start to accept.
On our borders, and yet the administration denies that we have a problem at the border. So I've got a number of questions. First of all, approximately what is the dollar value of the equipment that's been left behind that now the Taliban controls? What's the dollar value of that?
Senator, I believe the equipment provided over the last a little less than 20 years, 15 years, was about $80 billion. Of that equipment that remains, as you know, it was given, some was handed over to the Afghan security forces. And of course, some of that is now in the hands of the Taliban.
So I was also struck by your comment that in your testimony that even the most pessimistic assessment didn't predict the government would collapse as quickly as it did. But you just in your testimony said that the realistic predictions before the complete withdrawal was that it was going to collapse by the end of this year. So the administration continued with their plans of withdrawal, of evacuation, of surrender, knowing that the Taliban would be in control of $80 billion worth of sophisticated equipment at the end of that, correct? I mean, did that discussion ever come up in terms of maybe that wouldn't be a good idea, leaving all that equipment behind as we bug out of Afghanistan?
That assessment came in July. Much of the equipment, and again, I'll defer to my colleagues at the Pentagon who are more expert in this than I am. Much of that equipment was made inoperable. Other pieces of equipment will become inoperable because there is no ability on the part of the Taliban to maintain it. None of it, to the best of my knowledge, poses a strategic threat to us or to any of Afghanistan's neighbors. What we're looking at are primarily uniforms.
So we have an oversight letter. We'd like response on that. Let's just quick talk about the decision to close down Bagram. I mean, again, the president says this was, unanimously decided by the military, but isn't it true that the president decided what the troop level would be, a very minimal troop level? The president decided that we would keep the embassy open and it had to be protected. He forced the military's hands, right? In the end, it was his decision. It wasn't the military's decision to close Bagram.
The president makes the strategic decisions when it comes to the actual drawdown, the retrograde, to use the technical language. Those were decisions made by his military commanders. He sought their best advice, and that's what was carried out, including the timing of the decision to.
Another troubling piece of your testimony. You said when the president announced the withdrawal, NATO immediately unanimously embraced it. Joseph Borrell, the foreign affairs chief of the European Union, his statement on the surrender is that it's, quote, a catastrophe for the Afghan people, for Western values and credibility, and for the developing of international relations. The Wall Street Journal summarizes it quite nicely in their piece, just the title, How Biden Broke NATO. The chaotic Afghan withdrawal has shocked and angered U.S. allies. Again, that's detachment from reality that our NATO allies are on board with this thing. They're not.
Senator,
that's not what we're hearing.
Senator, I went to NATO well before the president's decision, along with Secretary of Defense Austin, and spent the day with all of our NATO allies, listening to them, their views, their prescriptions, their ideas for what we should do moving forward in Afghanistan. I shared some of our initial thinking at that point. We factored in everything we heard from our allies into our own decision-making process. When the president
just like you planned for every contingency. Okay, I got it.
If I could continue.
But now listen, it's bureaucratic speak. I have some questions. So again, my concern is the detachment from reality. So as we surrendered, as we're evacuating, as we're bugging out, we're hearing all these soothing comments from the administration. This is, like almost like a well-oiled machine here. We've got, flights just leaving and 124,000 people being evacuated. We heard something completely different. So tell me what is wrong about what I had heard. First of all, prior to the Taliban providing perimeter security, there was no security, and basically tens of thousands of Afghanis flooded into the Kabul airport, correct?
There was perimeter security around the airport established.
But we literally had tens of thousands of people. We did not know who these people were. It wasn't like people we invited in that were special immigrant visa holders, correct?
We did not control the city. We controlled the airport. Sorry if you.
But again, so we had tens of thousands of people in Kabul airport. The reports we were getting on the ground is many had no form of ID whatsoever. When I went to Fort McCoy, I asked the commanding general. Again, every contingency planned for. I asked the commanding general, when did you first find out that your mission would be as an intake facility for the Afghanistan refugees? He said 10 days ago. I asked the commanding general, I asked the representative from the Department of State, as well as from the Department of Homeland Security, do we know that every refugee that you've received so far, and there's only 1,000 at that point in time, do we know that they at least have some form of ID? And we didn't. We're hearing all these assurances that we're getting biometrically screened, a 14-step plan. I asked the head of Northern Command, he's at Fort McCoy, describe those steps to me. What do we screen them against? I mean, are ISIS terrorists, are Al-Qaeda terrorists, have we biometrically screened them in the past so that we can compare them to a database? What is that 14-step process in detail? Not just 14 steps. Tell me, describe to us in detail, how are we keeping this nation safe from such a chaotic situation?
So, Senator, the 14-step process refers specifically to the special immigrant visa applicants, and there is a lengthy process.
So how about for the other 124,000 people?
So yes, so to come to your point, Senator, a couple of things. We arranged, as you know, transit countries so that any Afghan coming out of Afghanistan would initially go to a transit country where we could initiate the screening, the vetting, the background checks. We surged Customs and Border Protection officials to those transit points, as well, of course, as other security law enforcement agencies to do these checks with biometric, biographic, other information that we have. Then, as people are cleared in these transit points, they then come into the United States, but they're not being resettled immediately. They are going, once they land at Dulles or in Philadelphia, they are then being sent to military bases where the checks continue and are completed.
But again, what checks? We need specifically what the checks are going to be.
Senator has expired. I'm sure you can follow up for the rest of your questions. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Risch, for this hearing, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for your service and your testimony today. We have, I'm sure, lots of opportunities to look backwards at the 20 years of our engagement in Afghanistan and its decisions, but I had hoped this committee would rise above the temptations of partisan politics and use this hearing to consider the urgent questions still before us, and I hope we'll get a few minutes to focus on this, Mr. Secretary. How do we get the remaining American citizens, legal permanent residents, and those Afghans who served alongside us or worked with and for us and who are most at risk out of Afghanistan? How do we make sure Afghanistan doesn't become a safe haven for terrorists again and deal with the Taliban? What leverage do we have in doing so? And to also make sure humanitarian aid gets into Afghanistan? And most urgently, how do we support and resettle those Afghan refugees whom we've evacuated to third countries and that much smaller population that has reached the United States? So let me just start with my thanks to the State Department, to the employees in Kabul and Qatar, and the DC-based task force that's worked with the evacuation and repatriation of Americans and Afghans, and to the many Delawareans and Americans whom I've heard from, former military, folks who served in Afghanistan, former diplomats and development professionals eager to help. And I look forward to continuing to coordinate with you and with agencies of our government, advocacy groups, and other partners on resettlement efforts. I'm glad that the former governor of Delaware, Jack Markell, has been asked to step forward and help coordinate this resettlement effort. And I was encouraged today to see Welcome US launch a broad, multi-faith, bipartisan national organization co-chaired by three former presidents, Bush and Obama and Clinton, and dozens of faith groups and nonprofits to welcome Afghans to the United States. So let me just start with a question about visa status. Senator Sullivan and I wrote a bipartisan letter in mid-August urging expanded eligibility for the SIV program. I'm interested in how you're working to expand eligibility under the existing visa programs to include family members and to support those the U.S. government supported and worked alongside, but who were not direct employees. I want to start, if I could, Mr. Secretary, by asking you just yes or no questions about three groups that other senators have mentioned.
Sure.
There's about 550 employees and family members from Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who were not evacuated. is the department prioritizing their evacuation?
Yes,
And the department committed to evacuating our partners from NED, the National Endowment of Democracy, NDI, IRA. Are those also being prioritized?
yes, they are.
And our partners from the American University of Afghanistan as well?
Yes.
And so if you would take the 4 minutes we've got left and explore with me, how do we ensure safe passage across land borders, whether into Tajikistan or Pakistan, safe and regular flights out of Afghanistan, whether from Mazar-e Sharif or Kabul, and how do we get documents into the hands of those who don't have identity documents, either because they were destroyed in our embassy or they destroyed them themselves out of fear of the Taliban? And how do we make sure that we're providing the financial support needed for the whole group of refugees who, after thorough vetting, ultimately reach the United States?
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. Those are all very important questions, and let me try to respond briefly to them, and we can take on the details after the session if need be. First, we needed and we have established a clear expectation from the Taliban about allowing people to continue to leave the country, to include American citizens, green card holders, Afghans who are properly documented with a visa, including specifically those who worked in some capacity for the United States. And not only do we have that understanding in public statements by the Taliban, of course, it's built into everything we've done with a large coalition of countries in terms of setting an expectation and making very clear that the failure to fulfill that expectation will have significant consequences, which we can get into. Second, very important to actually make sure that there are ways to travel freely from the country. We made an intensive effort before we left to understand and share with Qatar and Turkey, the countries that stepped up to do this, what was necessary to make sure that the airport in Kabul could continue to function, and ultimately not have charter flights and then commercial flights going in under International Civil Aviation Organization standards. We did intensive work. We brought the American contractors back in the midst of the evacuation, who had been running the airport, to work that. We handed off a very detailed plan, which is now being implemented. Third, the land crossings. We've worked with Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan on this to make sure that as we moved people out of Afghanistan, they would facilitate their crossing into their countries. We would have consular officials surged in the necessary places to handle people coming out in that fashion. And now, to your very important point about documentation, and this is something that maybe we can take offline, we are working on a mechanism and a means by which, and there are multiple ways of doing this, to make sure that people who don't have the necessary document, for example, a visa from us, a physical visa, to get that to them. And I'd prefer to go into more detail on that in another setting.
Understood. If I might, just as a closing question, you were asked at the outset, sort of what are the factors we weigh as we decide the future of our relationship with the Taliban? And we're in this difficult situation. Many of us recognize the Taliban is a terrorist organization that's done horrific things within Afghanistan in the past, yet we need to have some working relationship with them to secure the safe passage out of thousands of people who we still care deeply about. A number of American citizens with Delaware ties who I've been in contact with didn't leave because their families were still in Afghanistan. And there are clear measures that they should be expected to meet that you laid out in your opening statement. What do you think will be the most important aspects of our leverage to ensure the Taliban perform in ways that we would accept? And what do you think will be the turning point at which we'll make decisions with our allies to take sharper and harsher measures against the Taliban?
So simply put, the nature of the relationship that the Taliban would have with us or most other countries around the world will depend entirely on its conduct and actions, specifically with regard to freedom of travel, as well as to making good on its counterterrorism commitments, upholding basic rights of the Afghan people, not engaging in reprisals, et cetera. These are the things that not only we, but countries around the world are looking at. And there is, I think, significant leverage that we and other countries hold when it comes to things that the Taliban says it wants, but won't get if it does not act in a way that meets these expectations. For example, we talked a little bit before about the existing UN sanctions on the Taliban. These are significant, as well as travel restrictions. There's now a new Security Council resolution that we initiated setting out the expectations for what the Taliban has to do. If it's in violation of that resolution, it's hard to see any of these UN sanctions being lifted, travel restrictions being lifted, and indeed additional sanctions could well be imposed. Similarly, the foreign reserves of Afghanistan are almost exclusively in banks here in the United States, including the Federal Reserve, other banks, about $9 billion. All of that has been frozen. There are significant resources as well that are in the international financial institutions that Afghanistan normally would have access to. Those too have been frozen. Over the last 20 years or so, the international community has provided about 75% of the Afghan government's annual operating budget. That too has been frozen. So among many things that the Taliban says it seeks, both basic legitimacy and basic support, the United States, the international community, has a hand on a lot of that, much of that, most of that. And so we'll have to see going forward what conclusions the Taliban draws from that and what its conduct will be, matching these basic expectations that we've set.
Thank you, Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for taking time to answer our questions today. I'd like to associate myself with the comments that Senator Rubio made about planning for a potential immediate collapse of the Afghan government and security forces. It seemed that as the Taliban was running the table throughout Afghanistan, that the prospect of them continuing to run the table by coming into Kabul was a significant probability that should have been planned for. In your view, Mr. Secretary, has the Taliban abandoned their sympathy and collaboration with groups like Al Qaeda and the Haqqani network? Do they continue to have the same aim, and are they of like spirit, or has that relationship been severed?
The relationship has not been severed, and it's a very open question as to whether their views and the relationship has changed in any kind of definitive way. I think it's fair to say two things. One, whatever the Taliban's views on Al Qaeda, they do know that the last time they harbored Al Qaeda and it engaged in an outwardly directed attack, an attack on our homeland, certain things followed, which I believe it would have an interest in not seeing repeated. So whatever their views on Al Qaeda, there is a strong disincentive built in to allow it to engage in outwardly directed attacks, which the assessment of the intelligence community is they're not currently capable of doing. ISIS-K, the other main group, that's a different thing, as you know, because the Taliban and ISIS-K are sworn enemies. And in fact, over the last 5 or 6 years, since the emergence of ISIS-K, the fight has actually been between the Taliban and ISIS-K, with the Taliban taking most of the territory that ISIS-K sought to hold on to in Afghanistan. The question there, I think, is less whether they have the will to deal with ISIS-K and more whether they have the capacity.
Given that response, I know that previously the position of the administration and the State Department was that the 2001 AUMF no longer played a role of significance. But given the developments in Afghanistan and the Taliban's ongoing collaboration with and sympathy with Al Qaeda and the Haqqani network and like-minded groups, is it not appropriate for the State Department to revisit your recommendation that we abandon the 2001 AUMF?
I think, Senator, we need to look to make sure that we have all the authorities that we would need for any potential contingency, including the reemergence as a threat of Al Qaeda or the further emergence of ISIS-K as an outwardly directed threat. If we don't have those authorities, we should get them, whether that means relooking at those authorizations or writing new ones, which I think would be the most appropriate thing to do if necessary. We need to look at that.
I appreciate your willingness to change your point of view, in part because the conditions that have developed in the most recent weeks. Nothing wrong with conditions leading to a change in perspective. I for one, thought some years ago that we should withdraw from Afghanistan. the conditions I saw in the ensuing years convinced me that I was wrong. And I, like Senator Shaheen, was one of those that felt that President Trump was wrong to enter into an agreement to withdraw. I thought President Biden was wrong to enter into an agreement or to continue with that agreement to withdraw. And of course, I was appalled by the disastrous withdrawal process itself. For us today, however, I guess I'd like to focus more on the moral stain of leaving people behind. And understand what we can do to make sure that we are not leaving people behind. I understand we're down to a small number of Americans. It's hard to know exactly how many are left behind. But in terms of legal permanent residence, is your priority just as high to get them out as it is to get out citizens? Or is there a different level of commitment for a legal permanent residence return to the United States relative to a citizen?
Senator, our number one priority is American citizens. And that has, I think, long been the case. In this situation in Afghanistan, in this emergency evacuation in Afghanistan, we did everything we could as well to make sure that legal permanent residents, green card holders, would also identify themselves to us. We don't, like with American citizens, we don't know at any given time how many there are in any given country around the world, and to make available resources to help them. But our number one priority is any remaining American citizens who wish to leave.
I didn't realize there's a secondary level of priority then for a legal permanent resident. If that's the case, how many of them approximately, so we don't know the exact number, but how many legal permanent residents are we convinced are still in Afghanistan?
We don't have an exact number, but it's in the
But a round number?
in the thousands.
Pardon?
In the thousands.
In the thousands. Likewise, in terms of SIV holders or SIV applicants, or people who've worked with us that have been our partners through the years, how many of them approximately are still in Afghanistan that want to come to the United States?
So this is what we're doing an accounting of right now, based on two things: based on the pipeline of applicants as it existed before the evacuation, and then looking at those who we were able to evacuate. We don't have those numbers yet because as we've moved to evacuate people, a number of them are still at transit points around the world. Others,
but it would be tens of thousands.
So realistically, two things. One, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but of the applicants in the program, and as I said, we inherited about 18,000. About half of those, and this remains more or less the case now, are at a point where it's before the chief of mission has given his or her approval that they are in fact eligible for the program.
I
So
understand.
we focused on the.
I was looking for a number, and I guess the question I was leading to was this, which is given the fact that the SIV process was so slow and not undertaken during the Trump years in a significant way, you sped it up. That's great. Although you knew that there was no way you were going to get all these people out in time.
Let me put a final point
given the rapid collapse of the Afghan security forces. And you said yesterday that you inherited a date, but in fact you didn't inherit the date. The date was May 1st, and you pushed it to August 31st. Why didn't you push it much later so that we would have been able to process the SIV applicants as well as those who had worked with us that had not yet applied? I don't understand why a date was actually not inherited and a date was not selected that would be sufficient to actually remove people from the nation in a way that would be in keeping with our moral commitment to honor our citizens, our green card holders, as well as those who worked with us over the years.
Two things, if I may. First, we took some risk in terms of what the Taliban would do or not do after May 1st in pushing beyond May 1st. And we, of course, worked this very hard because
it's a risk with other people we took.
It's a risk.
The risk was on people we care for.
Yeah, just to be clear, if I could, the military told us that in order to do its retrograde, its drawdown from Afghanistan in a safe and orderly way, it needed 3 to 4 months. That's why we pushed to move beyond May 1st and to get to the end of August, early September. Second, to your point, which is an important one and a good one, our expectation was that beyond August 31st, beyond the military drawdown, the government, the security forces were going to remain in control of Kabul, of the major cities. Our embassy was fully planned to remain up and running. We were leaving about 600 military behind to make sure that we could secure the embassy. so that it could continue to operate. We had robust programming plan to include continuing to bring out anyone who wished to leave, notably SIVs. So that was very much the plan and the expectation. What we did not anticipate was that 11-day collapse of the government and security forces. That's what changed everything.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for spending so much time with us. I think what links our failures in Iraq and Afghanistan is that they're both fundamentally failures of hubris, believing that we can control things and influence events on the other side of the world that are beyond our control or influence. America can be a force for good in the world, but there is a limit to what we can achieve. And so there's been decades-long magical thinking with respect to what's in our control and what's outside of our control. As it turns out, it wasn't within our control to be able to stand up an American-style democracy, an American-looking military in Afghanistan that was going to be able to protect the country from the Taliban, but we spent 20 years trying to achieve it. And so, Mr. Secretary, you covered some of this in your opening remarks, but I wanted to ask you a series of questions to try to level set for the committee the situation you inherited, right? What was in your control? What was outside of your control? And then to look at the events of the last 30 to 40 days with that same lens. What was in your control? What was outside of your control? I think these are yes or no answers. Some of it you've covered in your testimony, but I think it's important to get it on the record. So, Mr. Secretary, if President Biden had chosen to breach the agreement that President Trump had signed with the Taliban, would the Taliban have restarted attacks against U.S. troops and bases?
Yes.
As you said in your opening testimony, by the time your administration took office, the Taliban was on the outskirts of several provincial capitals. If President Biden had chosen to breach the agreement between President Trump and the Taliban, would the Taliban have begun offensives on these urban centers?
Yes.
So if the Taliban had begun its siege on these cities and resumed attacks on U.S. troops, would 2,500 troops have been enough to keep the country from falling to the Taliban?
No.
Would double that number have been enough? Do we know how big our force would have had to have gotten?
I think it was the assessment of our military leaders that, not to put a number on it, but significant additional U.S. forces would have been required both to protect ourselves and to prevent the onslaught from the Taliban against the provincial capitals and ultimately against Kabul.
This wasn't a decision between leaving and the status quo. This was a decision between a significant commitment of new U.S. resources to the fight or the continuation of a withdrawal plan.
That's correct.
Okay, let's talk about the last month. So once the Afghan government and the military disintegrate all at once, it seems to me it was pretty predictable and understandable that there would be panic on the ground amongst the Afghan people. So could it be expected that a few thousand U.S. troops and diplomats on the ground at the time would have been able to prevent this panic?
No.
Much has been made about these dramatic and heartbreaking scenes at the airport. Were 2,500 or 5,000 troops enough to stop the Afghan people from rushing to the airport? It created this security nightmare for you, but was there any way for the limited number of personnel that were there to prevent individuals from rushing to the airport?
No, they could control the airport as we did. They could establish a basic immediate perimeter around the airport as we did, but they couldn't control what happened beyond that perimeter.
And so let's talk about that perimeter. Others say, well, we should have controlled a bigger perimeter. We should have taken.
All right, well, that's enough of that. Thank you for joining the Lady Lacey show today. We got a little bit of information, and I got a few more things to do. I might be back on later. I don't know. But I love you guys. Do the best you today, and we are the best.